Hello, everyone. I'll be doing my presentation on case study number 11, Here Comes the Judge. This case is about Robert Ruhlman, a judge in Hamilton County, Ohio, that says he regularly calls the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement on defendants in his courtroom based on their appearance and race. He said that he typically feels the need to call ICE when the defendant speaks Spanish. This is an example of racial profiling. His claims are that the practice is not illegal in any way, and there is nothing saying that his conduct is not allowed. He also goes on to say if the defendant isn't an illegal immigrant, then there's no harm done. The question at hand is it morally right for an authority member to make a rash decision based off intuition and racial profiling? The answer to this is no. It is not morally right for an authority member to make a rash decision based off intuition and racial profiling. One of the first theories that I'll be presenting that goes along with the argument against Judge Ruhlman's practice is Kantian ethics. Kantian ethics is a moral philosophy introduced by Immanuel Kant that emphasizes the morality of the action or decision is not determined by its consequences but by the motivation of the doer. In The Ethical Life by Schaefer Landau on page 107, it says that Kantian ethics provide two key elements of the moral philosophy. The first of the two elements is goodwill. Kant says that the goodwill is the only thing that possesses of unconditional value, as it is valuable in its own right. It goes on to say that the goodwill is the steady commitment to do our duty for its own sake. Our actions possess moral worth, if and only if they are prompted by the goodwill. The second element is the categorical imperative. Kant believes that we must sometimes give help to others in need, even if we don't want to, and even if such help gets us nothing that we care about in return. Kant believes that moral action is rational action. With that being said, we can certainly put racial profiling outside of being aligned with Kantian ethics. As it says here, if racial profiling is not imperative, then it is not humane. If it is not humane, then it cannot be morally just. Therefore, racial profiling is not morally just. The next moral theory that will be talked about is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the moral theory that states that an action is just if it is useful and beneficial for the majority. This theory will be able to work, but there will be a great counter-argument if it was used. If alerting ICE whenever a person of Latin descent comes into the courtroom and 90% of the time it just so happens that they are in fact illegal, then it would be beneficial for the majority. With that being beneficial to the majority, it is now morally acceptable for a judge to racially profile every person that is of a Latin descent that comes into his courtroom. And that is why we'll be looking at classical utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism is the moral theory that states an action is just if it produces the greatest amount of overall happiness. This coincides with the argument against Judge Ruhlman and his practice. The argument for classical utilitarianism states, 1. If the judge is able to do her job effectively and the suspect receives a fair trial, then both parties are satisfied. If both parties are satisfied, that means that the most overall amount of happiness has come from the situation. If the most overall amount of happiness comes from a situation, it makes the act morally just. The last theory that I will use in my argument is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is the moral theory that is concerned with the moral character of goodness of the individual carrying out an action. In the book Fundamentals of Ethics by Schaefer Landau, it states, for a person to be virtuous, it is for them to understand that the right thing to do will always be strongly motivated to do it, without regret or reluctance, for all the right reasons. Argument for virtue ethics is, 1. An act in a given situation is morally required just because all virtuous people acting in character will perform it. 2. An act in a given situation is morally permitted just because some, but not all virtuous people acting in character will perform it. 3. An act in a given situation is morally forbidden just because no virtuous people acting in character will perform it. The argument of a virtue ethicist against Judge Ruhlman is, 1. Racial profiling from someone in the court of law could in fact hurt someone emotionally or mentally. 2, if a person of authority is causing harm to another person, it is not a virtuous act. 3, if the act is not a virtuous act, it is morally wrong. 4, therefore, racially profiling from a person of authority is morally wrong. There are plenty of different arguments that ethicists can bring up, but the one I will be touching on is the doctrine of double effect. The doctrine of double effect is the moral theory that if your goal is worthwhile, you are sometimes permitted to act in ways that foreseeably cause certain harms, though you must never intend to cause those harms. As I would agree with this argument in most cases, I'll have to disagree with this in this situation. Judge Ruhlman could perhaps make a case that he is acting in ways that may cause harm, but is not intentionally trying to cause harm. But I would have to disagree with that statement. The judge may just be trying to make his job easier, but his acts are racially motivated. I'm not 100% certain, but I can assume that if a white man with a suit and tie that spoke the proper American English vernacular came into his courtroom, it wouldn't even cross his mind about calling ICE. This is why this counter argument is not valid. Let's recap my presentation. We talked about how Kantian ethics plays a role in breaking down the humane aspect of the argument, classical utilitarianism, and the overall happiness between both parties, virtue ethics, and outlook on how the virtuous person would act in this situation, and lastly, the counter argument of the doctrine of double effect. Thank you for listening to my presentation.